So I was out taking photographs for a rezoning effort we had recently, and when I was adjacent to this site, I saw big piles of concrete and bricks, and the thing that really drew my attention was where I was and this red brick and mortar chunk here that came out of the ground. And what this is a brick foundation. Normally, brick walls sit on top of concrete foundations. We see a lot of concrete here, but this is actually a brick foundation piece. And I noticed that and I was like, wow, the area I was is where the Villa Maria Ursuline Academy was. So the Ursuline Sisters was a Catholic order that founded in 1535, came to New Orleans 1727, and Galveston 1846. And they, in 1895, Nicholas Clayton designed this academy building in Galveston. Nicholas Clayton is in a list of top 5 or so deity architects in Texas. If you ever see any books about classic Texas courthouses, the ones they tout the most are Nicholas Clayton courthouses. They're the most over-the-top, ornamented, Beaux-Arts style buildings of their era. Nicholas Clayton is probably outrun Frank Lloyd Wright as famous architect in the state of Texas. Did a lot more work than Frank Lloyd Wright. Anyhow, so here's this building, obviously really Gothic and over the top in Galveston. Here's a picture of it in September 1900, right after the storm. Well, the timeline of this is pretty amazing. And I gave this same presentation at Landmark Commission last night. As I told them, it's amazing, with cell phones and computers and digital communications, it still takes us a while to do things. Well, the storm happened in September, and by December 3rd, the Sisters of St. Ursula came and bought 50 acres in Bryan, Texas, to move their convent inland so they wouldn't be hit by storms anymore. They bought it from William and Mary Cavett, and just a few months after this storm. Going back to this slide, there's a really neat little publication that was done in 1998 as part of the Rice Design Alliance quarterly publication. It's called the Bryan-College Station A&M, an architectural tour, and the author is a guy named Stephen Fox. And on page 2, right at the first of discussion of architecture in Brazos County in general, he says, at this intersection of Osborne and Ursuline, there have been the 2 most significant architectural buildings in Bryan. And he goes on to say, and both of them were destroyed by fire. I haven't actually found proof of that. I don't know where he came up with that, but I don't doubt that that's true. That link there is to that particular publication. It's, 50 pages long, and it goes through neighborhood by neighborhood and talks about significant architecture in Bryan-College Station. It's a really cool little deal. And
would you send that to us, Randy?
Yeah,
or
I'll
at
send
least
that
me,
to
I'd
you.
like a link.
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
So here's this 50 acres. It is basically bound by, I guess what it is now is East Villa Maria, Osborne, and Howell streets. And it's, like I say, 50 acres. Bought it from the Cavetts for about $1,000 in December 1903. Also in December 1903, there was ads in Texas newspapers saying, we want bids for this building we've designed, and submit the bids to Mr. Doremus, who is an attorney here in Bryan, or to Nicholas J. Clayton's office in Galveston. So Nicholas J. Clayton designed the building that ended up being Villa Maria. Anyhow, they called it St. Ursula's Hill, and of course I had to check because everybody's calling something Hill or Estates or something. I'll be danged. It is on a hill. It actually sits on a high spot. Now, it's not as high as where we are right now, but it's higher than other areas around it. So March 20th, 1901, remember they just bought the land December 3rd. March 20th, they're laying the cornerstone. And this is just the first part of an article that goes on and on and on, describing all of these people that came to Bryan and participated in the laying of this cornerstone. They even had a carriage by carriage list of the people that came out there. You know, the mayor of Bryan, the Virginia Rifles, all these different units and, Army units and stuff. And the various, every church was represented in this cornerstone laying. And so, I'd seen pictures of this building before and I always wondered which direction it faced. Well, turns out they put it dead north and south. So it actually faced what was Ursuline Drive, now East Villa Maria. This is the 1901 Sanborn map, which is kind of amazing that this image was on this map. When they just started building the building, they laid the cornerstone in March, and it made it on the 1901 Sanborn insurance map. Basically, they built the building that has a dormitory, classrooms, a chapel, and a separate house for priests. Now, what we're seeing here, the pink represents load-bearing masonry, and the yellow is the wooden parts of the structure, the wood porches that face the north. Then 1906, we see that they've added a lot more porches on the outside. They've developed the site a little more. And then in 1912, we see that they put a big auditorium section, 3 stories tall. Got an auditorium on the first floor, classrooms on the second floor, and a dormitory on the third floor. Interestingly, apparently they didn't build it out in anywhere near the same style, and they didn't build it out of the same building materials. In fact, use a completely different brick for that part of the building. So here's a photograph. I'm gonna call it 1910. It could be 1905. The landscaping's getting a little mature, so I don't think it's any much earlier than 1905. This is printed on a postcard, about the same era, hand-colored postcard. This is a really neat image that the Carnegie Library owns. I think this photograph is somewhere between 2 and 3 feet wide. It's made with a panogram camera where they basically open the shutter and they have a clock system that tracks the thing around. It's real wide angle, and you can't really tell on this in the screen, but it's in tremendous detail, fine-grained photograph, and you can look right in here and see some details about this building that are really fascinating. This is the only picture that I'm aware of. I think I've seen others that may show the after 1912 building, but this, you can see the building, the addition of that auditorium building looming in this photograph. So the Ursuline order was successful for a few years, but by the mid-20s, by 1929, they weren't doing so well. They didn't have many young ladies going to school there, and they decided that they were going to close the school. And when they started talking about that, the state of Texas said, well, maybe we should buy it and put our insane asylum there. And I think this could be before Rusk State Hospital. I didn't stop to check that. But I don't know, I kind of feel like good news they didn't do that. Anyhow, by 1935, this fellow decides, I'm going to buy the place, the 50 acres, and I'm going to build a new house there. And this is W.S. Howell Jr. And around the same time, a week or so, it looks like about a month later, we see an item that says they're tearing down the buildings. And it says that Howell bought the land, but he didn't buy the buildings. And so this J.H. Nash is tearing down the buildings, and he's going to be selling building materials. I never found anything that said that the buildings had burned. but according to Stephen Fox, in 1998, they had suffered at least partial destruction. So here they are. Mr. Howell's going to build his house there. And so this is Mr. Howell in around World War I. He was born in Bryan in 1893. If you think of the places you've seen the word Howell in Bryan, it's a lot. Probably the most prominent is Howell Wholesale Grocers, there where Papa Perez is, that sign. The Howell family was very large, very prominent, and they were fairly accomplished folks. I think they were the ones that started the City National Bank. Planters and Merchants and First National had been here for a long time, and about 1902, the Howells and some other folks started the City National, which became every bit as substantial as First National. But anyhow, this fella, you look at his years of working for the State Department, 1916 to 1935, and the places where he worked, this guy saw a lot of stuff in his life. And he was educated. I don't think he went to Bryan schools. I think he was privately educated. He got what in those days passed for a law degree from UT. I don't think they had, I think a law program was more like a year and a half at UT. You read law, and they didn't license lawyers back then. But he was a lawyer, and he went to work for the Foreign Service and served in various secretarial roles. And ultimately, he became like the first secretary to the Paris embassy, or the first secretary to in India, which means there was one person above him, and that was the ambassador. So he had some extremely high-profile jobs during a pretty fascinating time. And he's a guy from Bryan, Texas, and I sure didn't know his name was Williamson. But I'd always seen his name, and the reason I saw his name was because of a story relating to him being appointed ambassador to Uruguay. I'll get to that in a second. One of the things I found out about him was that he was the guy that said, you know what, Main Street needs to be connected to College Road. Because if you look at old photographs of Bryan up until the even in the 30s, aerial photographs, Main Street stopped about 29th, and there was just nothing south of it. You had to go down what is now Texas Avenue and scoot over by where John Henserling's car lot is to go out to A&M, or you would go straight on Highway 6. In the mid-30s was when A&M reoriented the campus to, instead of facing the railroad track, they reoriented it facing Highway 6. But this guy was the one that said, we need to directly connect our central business district to A&M College with a road. And so during the late 30s and up through World War II, they had already started buying right-of-way along the H&TC right-of-way, and they planned that the vision was that downtown would just extend to the south. And this guy, if you read about him in the Eagle, he was one of the ones that was really pushing this. So he gets here, he buys his 50 acres. Turns out he bought a lot of building materials from Mr. Nash, because apparently he bought all the bricks that came out of the Ursuline Academy. And he hired Delano and Aldrich in 1938 to design the Howell House. And Delano and Aldrich, if you read about architects, they're the guys the guys that did things like all the Newport mansions in Rhode Island were McKim, Mead, and White in the 1880s and 90s. Delano and Aldrich replaced those guys as being the cool architects in the early 20th century. And apparently Howell became familiar with them while he was in Paris, because at the same time he was first secretary at the embassy in Paris, they were designing the new Paris embassy building. And they do some real extraordinary, over-the-top buildings. And he hired them to build design this house. It is the only example of their architecture in the state of Texas. And so he builds this grand house. Here is a 1940 aerial photograph. You can see this is Osborne Street. This is what became Osborne. This is what became Howell House Lane. And the way the house was designed, the house is right in here. And there's this kind of Gardens of Versailles thing happening. So the front of the house was supposed to be in Howell House Lane. And this, where Ursuline comes along, this was the service entrance. There's some barns and outbuildings over here, and there's a big garden space here. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see some formal gardens out here with a big tree. So the Ursuline Academy buildings were right on this footprint. And so one interesting thing that I failed to mention to the Landmark Commission last night, if you go over here on the Howell House Lane, there is a couple of concrete fence posts that are about 18 inches square, maybe 8 feet tall, with a ton of steel sticking out of them that looks like they'll stop a tank. And they are the gate right there. There was a big farm outbuilding, and apparently this was all agriculture out here. I didn't see where Howell owned this, but whatever was right there was something real important from the size of those gates, and they're still there. Anyhow, that's kind of an aside. Anyhow, so he had quite an estate here on his 50-acre former convent girls' school property. You can. This is 1940. This is our most recent aerial photograph. You can see this group of trees right here, probably, and they scale off to be these trees right here. Obviously, we lost this one. Didn't bother to get an earlier photograph, but just a few years ago, this thing had, its trees were still intact. I mean, it was a thick double row of trees that go out to Prairie Drive. So Howell gets appointed to be the ambassador to Uruguay, and the story I always heard about him was that he was leaving to go to New Orleans to take a boat to Montevideo, Uruguay. And the morning he left, he walked up to the train station, or was driven up to the train station, about to get on the train, dropped dead of a heart attack. You know, you don't always believe stories. Turns out they went to wake him up that morning. He was already dead in bed. So he didn't die on the train station. He died at home. But, basically he was appointed by Harry Truman to be the ambassador, and he never made it. What happened to the Howell House? Well, I think in the early 80s, Paul and Merrill Bonarigo bought the property, and I don't know if the house had burned before they bought it or it burned after they bought it, and I didn't take the time to call them to ask. But when I moved here in '84, they always referred to that property as the brick farm. There were no buildings there, but there were piles of brick everywhere. And so the Bonarigos owned it for a long time, and they went out on the Old Reliance when they established Messina Hoff. And this is a pre-engineered metal building built pretty much like any agricultural or industrial building, but they used all these Howell House bricks on it. And so if you go out there today, the bricks on this building are from the Ursuline Academy that was built in 1901 in Bryan, Texas, as a result of the 1900 storm. I'm also pretty sure that if you go to 616 East 31st, there's a large house that was moved onto that property in 1984, and all the bricks around it and the chimney are bricks that came from the Howell House as well. So this year, or late last year, we started discussions on a condo project, and in fact, I think you guys did maybe a conditional use permit. I think you've seen this drawing before. Well, this is this piece of property, and this is what's being built there today. And when I went over to take pictures for another thing, and I saw these piles, that's what's prompted this research and learning about this place, because the day I was there was an extraordinary amount of stuff coming out of the ground. There's nothing here for scale, but that piece of concrete right there is about the size of a Suburban.
Oh.
It's 14 or 15 feet long, 4 or 5 feet wide, and I can't imagine how much it costs to get that sucker taken out of the ground and hauled off. I have to expect that the developer came in for a very unpleasant surprise, because when they started digging foundations for this condo project, it was the gift that kept on giving as far as concrete. And so those brick foundations were put there in 1901, I feel fairly sure, because they didn't use concrete for foundations in that era. It wasn't long after that they started using poured concrete for that, but that's the last of the Villa Maria Academy that just came out of the ground just a few months ago. So that's my story. And
Thank you. Randy, I know we've got to go, but I just want to ask real quickly. So once the Howell house was, what happened to it? So they said it
according
burned
to
and they
Stephen
tore it
Fox,
down?
it burned,
Okay.
and then I believe the Bonarigos had to take it down, and that's where the brick farm came from.
Now, did the Allens build, we used to call the Allen house, or the Allen, there was.
That's a little farther to the west.
Oh, okay,
And-
okay, gotcha.
And if right about here is a 10-acre tract of land with a very substantial 1950s house on it that I think the guy's name was Nat Allen. You can't see it from the road, but it's big. I mean, it's 5,000, 6,000 square feet tucked back in there. And then there were some other Allen family houses, because the Allen Academy got here even before the Ursulines did. So,
Gotcha. Thanks so much, Randy.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Happy 150th birthday. So,
Thank you.
all right.